How about now? Still nothing? Audio input. Let's see. Properties. Triton headset. How about now? Still nothing?
No, it's still nothing.
Is your audio on?
Audio's on, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Oh, there we go.
Oh, you can hear it now? Okay, perfect. Sorry about that. If you've been watching and there was no audio, apparently we did have a little bit of a technical issue, but it seems like it's all fixed now. So what you've missed is we've just been going over a little bit of a warm-up with some figure drawing, just to get our hands used to drawing, used to getting those curves on the page. And as we're loosening up, I'm not going to go back in and redraw those ones, but we do still have a couple more that we can go through. So for this one, as I was saying before, I'm looking for those curves in the head as it's tilted back compared to the body, which is going to be pointing the opposite direction. So here I'm really thinking about that shoulder and where it's sitting, and I'm going to really think about how that body is going to be scrunched up as it's coming down, the curve in the back, and how it's going to be bending forward. So almost like a bean shape or a pillow that's being bent down towards us. Here when I get to the legs, because this leg is foreshortened, I'm going to think about where the bottom of that leg is, where it attaches to the body, and where the knee is going to be. So the knee is right up here. And you can see how short that leg is actually going to appear in our drawing. It's going to be something like that. And then the bottom of the leg is going to connect down this way. Over here, same thing, that knee is going to be somewhere right here as it connects inwards. And then back down with her foot back here. So I might have something like that. This arm here is going to be coming forward and sitting in front of those legs. And I'm really thinking about those overlaps and how the chest is going to overlap the arm at the top, but then the arm is going to overlap everything else along the bottom. And even for the hands, I'm keeping them very, very, very simple. I'm not focusing too much on details. I really just want to get those basic forms in. Here I can give a little bit of an indication of the hair as it comes down, comes in front of the face, a line for the eyes as they're moving this way, keeping the expression really simple at the beginning. And then I can always clean it up and add details later, and that's something that we're going to talk a little bit more about once we go into the actual drawings for this evening. But for now, we're just going to keep this really, really simple. And this arm is going to come down this way. So it's going to look something like this. All right. That skirt is going to create its own sort of shape down here. And you'll see I'm not spending too much time going into a lot of detail. As long as I have the basic drawing done, then I should be good to go. Here the chin just seems a little bit too wide. So I will make adjustments as I go along. However, for this particular drawing, because it is just a warm-up, I'm not going to spend too much time on it. Alright, so something like that. Let's go to this one over here. I'm just going to take this drawing and shrink it down just a little bit. And let's bring this down. Okay, so here, really great pose. Sometimes it's a good idea to draw very small at the beginning. It does let you see the entire pose at once, as opposed to seeing it as individual separate parts. And so here, I can draw this really quickly without worrying about any details. So something like that. I'm noticing how the shoulders are moving up this way, and how the hips are going to be pointing sort of more this way. The hips and the shoulders tend to move in opposite directions. So keeping that in mind is going to give you a really nice natural pose so that it doesn't feel super stiff. And always remember to exaggerate your poses as much as you can at the beginning so that later on they will look more natural as you add more details. All of these details here, all these little curves and everything in the leg, I've really simplified it into this S-curve coming through because I know that I can add more details afterwards and clean it up as I go on. Little indication for the hair. And then now I can zoom in a little bit and try to get a little bit more detail in there. Something in the shoulder, the back as it comes down and curves towards the hips, the natural curves of the body. And here, again, is where a little bit of understanding of anatomy is going to be really helpful so that you know where all the main muscle groups are in the body and the legs as you're coming down. The calf muscle back here, and then the feet pointing down this way. Same thing on this side, a really great curve going this way, pointing back, and then coming over like this. Now I can indicate a little bit of her outfit. And voila. Maybe an indication for the eye, just to show the tilt of the head. Nose, a little bit of the mouth. Keep it really, really, really simple. So something like that. And then her hands are holding her hair, so I'm going to indicate that a little bit as well. Okay, so I think that should be good for this one. Just indicate a little bit of shading for her outfit. Okay. Let's do two more really quick. Sometimes I like to try and test myself to see how fast I can get the figure down. So this one I'll try to get it down as fast as I possibly can, just to really loosen up. Curve in the back. Keeping in mind that center line as it comes forward and then bends this way. Indication of the legs. This one's coming here, and I'm always looking for the angle of the hips, the shoulders, the relationship to the knees, also very, very important. It's going to help your figure seem more realistic, and it's going to make sure that all your proportions are they're correct and they relate well to one another. Here I give a little context with the chair. Something like that, but very, very, very quick. Make the head a little bit bigger there to include some of that hair. The line for the eyes, the face as it's looking right at us. Keep it really, really, really simple. No details at this point. Even the folds in the clothes, I'm not worrying too much about that. I'm just looking for basic folds that are going to show those bends in the body, but that's about it. So something that looks something like this. Okay. Indication of ears, and then there we go. So there we go, super, super quick. And let's do one more over here. Okay. So same thing as before, I'm really looking for that curve in the back. And I'm going to try to capture that motion, that movement as best I can. Again, zooming out to be able to see the whole figure at once. Always indicate the shoulders so that you know the turn of the body, and then the bend in the spine, which I'm going to always exaggerate a little bit if I can. Alright, so something like that. The legs. So I always leave the arms for last because generally what I'll do is I'll start with the biggest shapes first, and then I'll slowly move into the smaller ones. So the torso being the biggest thing usually ends up being first, and then the legs, and then the arms afterwards. So her boot is going to be down here. This other leg is going to come over this way. This arm is going to come down. I'm going to lower the shoulder just a little bit here. As the arm comes down between the legs. And then here as well, I'm going to make the head just a little bit bigger, just to fit with the size of the body a little bit more. An indication of the eyes, like that, and then this arm over here with the hand resting on the leg. A couple clues for outfit, for clothing. Simple indication for nose, and that might be my basic gesture for this pose. So as you can see, I'm working really, really loose, really simple. I'm not worried about details, and even if it's very messy, that's perfectly fine, because you can always refine it and clean it up in those rendering stages. So now that I've warmed up, I'm going to go into the actual drawing portion of this lesson. So let's go over here, and I'm just going to hide some of these that we don't need currently. So let's make a new layer, and I'm going to start with this one right here. And so for this one, I am going to go into the details. I'm going to go into the full sketch with a little bit of shading in it as well. But I'm not going to clean the line work just yet. I'm going to wait, and I'm going to do a separate drawing for that one. So right now, the things that I'm looking for are this sort of S-curve that's moving through the body this way. Okay, that's the main curve that I'm seeing. So that's what I'm going to focus on, because if I can capture that really well, then the rest of the drawing will come together. So let's see if we can capture that S-curve as it comes down that way. It's going to be something like this. The shoulders make this great triangle as the shoulders tilt downwards. The body itself with the spine is pointing this way. The hips are also pointing down towards us, pointing that way, the opposite direction of the shoulders. And so you can see the relationship between this curve here through the back and this curve here through the center of the body. Again, keeping it really, really, really simple at the beginning. Trying to get that sense of balance in the pose, that he's resting his weight on that back leg. So that one's going to be a lot more straight, while this leg here is going to be a little bit more off to the side. There's not as much weight being put on it, and so it's going to have a lot more curve to it. I'm also thinking about the silhouette, so the overall outline shape that I'm seeing in my body, because I want to make sure that the relationship between the width and the height of all the different parts work together well. I'm also going to start indicating the head. And in this case, the head is tilted up a little bit. So I'm going to indicate that by curving the lines of the eyes, the nose, and the mouth upwards, and especially the bottom of the chin, to show that we are seeing the underside of that chin under there. And you'll see, obviously, I've tilted the head a little bit more than it is in the model, again, because I'm exaggerating in order to loosen up the figure, so that when I do go into details, it should clear itself up, and it'll stiffen a little bit as we go on. All right, so now I'm indicating a little bit of clothing in here, and maybe a couple indications for folds.
How would you do that?
So here, when it comes to the folds themselves, I'm looking for not these little tiny ones, but I'm looking for the overall basic shapes. So I'm looking at how this cloth here, I'm seeing these big triangular shapes on this side. So in there, there's always going to be a fold in here under the armpit. There's always going to be these lines pointing out this way as the arm curves downwards, and that fabric has to bend around the arm. So the more you practice fabric, you start to get used to different types of folds, and you start to notice familiar folds, and you'll realize that where the armpit is, there's always very similar folds happening in those places. So here I always know that there's going to be curves moving up into the armpit, around up that way, as this comes down like that. Here for the clothing, for the folds on the center, I'm just looking for the direction. I'm looking at how everything seems to be pinching like a triangle in this way. Okay, so that's the general direction that everything's going to be moving in. So that's what I'm going to try to focus on at the beginning. Get those basic forms pushing in that direction, and then I can always, again, clean those up as we go along. A little indication of a collar in here. And notice how I'm using a fairly thick brush, very loose strokes. I'm just trying to get the basic shapes in there. And then now as we get into the pants, I'm going to notice how the clothing folds, usually in the crotch area. It comes out this way as it comes down into that leg, and then down into the pants, like that. Over here, there's more of a curve on the outside, on the top portion of his thigh, and then the rest of the curve is on the back portion. So I'm going to try and keep that flow through the body. Oh. So something like that. Notice how, again, I didn't go into any of these tiny little folds. I just kept them very, very simple. I'm just focusing on the big folds first, the ones that are going to really indicate where the clothing is bending. And then afterwards, I'm going to worry about those little, the tinier ones. So here I notice that the feet need to be just a little bit lower. So something like that. And then here, narrow that ankle. And I'm looking at that relationship between the tips of the feet, that angle that's coming up this way, the angle of the pants coming this way, the tips of the shoes, or the tongue of the shoes, sorry, coming that way. So all these lines are actually pointing in different directions like this. It's like they're converging in perspective. So I'm going to keep that in mind as I'm going through, and I'm going to really notice that, okay, here, I need to lower this a little bit more to capture that angle. So I might go in and just lengthen that leg just a little bit. So I might have something like that. And then that way, this shoe can come out. That way now the relationship and that perspective is going to be a lot more correct. So don't be afraid to make those changes as you're going through. It's better to make corrections now than to wait until you get to the rendering stage, and then it's going to be really, really tough to make those big changes. Okay, from this point, what I might do is start indicating areas of shading. So I'll indicate that, yeah, there's a shadow on this side. And I'm looking for those very simple shadow shapes. I know how everything pinches in the knee, creates some shadows in there as this comes down this way. And I'm looking for those very, very basic shadow shapes as well. Even the shadows, I'm thinking of them as their own shapes coming this way. And again, I'm simplifying it as much as I can at the beginning so that afterwards, once I go into my actual coloring, then it'll be a lot easier to know what I'm doing. Okay, I can get an indication of the eye. The nose is going to be much higher because his head is tilted back. Indication of the ear. So we should have something that looks like this. Okay, so that's a very, very simplified gesture drawing. The very, very basic sketch. From here, I might jump right into the actual line work and start cleaning this up in a new layer. So you'll see if you spend more time, you can actually render out all of the details. You can render out all of these little details, clean up your line works, clean up those shadow shapes a little bit more. But this is generally where I'll get to with the rough sketch. So from here, let's go into how I would actually clean up the line work from that rough sketch itself. So for that, I've got a drawing over here. So this is a drawing of a girl, and I believe it's this one here. So I'll move this one here. Okay, so for this one, this is the rough sketch. I did exactly what we saw with the guy with the white pants. Same thing here, really rough sketch, really loose, kept everything very simple. And then what I'll do is I'll lower the opacity on this layer. I'll create a new layer over top, and then using a, usually I like to use a basic round brush for this with the pressure opacity set on that so that I can get really nice clean lines. You don't want to use your airbrush for this stage because it's going to make your lines feel a little bit hazy, and if your lines are fuzzy, then your drawing is going to overall, it's going to look very blurry. So let's go in, and because I have my general sketch all complete, going in and zooming in onto the sketch and really cleaning up that line work is going to be so much easier now because I don't have to worry about the overall composition. Okay, all of that is already taken care of, so now I can really just go in there and clean up those lines as best as I can. Sometimes, depending on the drawing, I'll actually have multiple line layers done, so I might do one pass, and then I'll create a new layer, lower the opacity on this one, and then clean up the lines even more in a separate layer. So this is where I'm going to go in and really commit to some of those shapes, some of those lines. I'm going to start to notice those overlapping layers in the hair. And for the hair, I'm not thinking of each individual strand, I'm thinking of the overall shapes that are created in the hair. So I'm thinking of these blocks of almost ribbon-like structures through the hair. So you'll see even here, my drawing is not perfectly clean. Depending on the level of refinement that you want in your drawing, you can kind of leave it at this stage, or if you really want, you can go in, like I said, with another pass and clean it up even more. It just depends on how clean and refined you want it to look in the end. So again, here my face is very simplified, and I'm going to go in and just clean that up a little bit. Like that. Still trying to keep it simple, and I'm trying as best I can to maintain the same feeling, the same emotion as I did with the rough sketch. Unfortunately, this is a very common sort of issue that I found was that your rough sketch is always going to look very lively. It's going to look a lot better than your refined line work, and that's usually because as you go in and refine things, it's going to naturally stiffen your drawing. So that is an unfortunate side effect. So if you find that your overall, your rough sketch looked just generally better, it felt a little bit more alive than your line work, that does happen. You try to get as close to the looseness of that rough sketch as you can, but unfortunately, it's not always going to work out so well. So I'm trying my best here to keep a lot of that same feeling in the face. Seeing how that collar comes down and wraps around. So in here, I'm again committing to some of those folds. I'm looking for those shadow shapes that are created. And in here, notice how there's this great shape that's created with those shadows. Because we're losing all of that detail, I'm going to actually think about that as its own shape in there. So something like that. I'm going to look for the relationship between these curves on the outside and how those folds are moving on the inside, because there usually is a relationship that's happening there. This curve out here is actually leading into this fold on the inside. So I'm going to keep that in mind as I'm drawing to make sure that those relationships stay correct. Right here, I'm going to narrow this a little bit, and here I put too much of an angle in that collar, so I'm going to thin that down, and I'm just going to clean that up just a little bit more. Okay, let's go on to this side. Coming down. So something like that. Now I can get into the hands, and thankfully I do have my hands more or less sketched out underneath. So I can start to indicate the fingers. Having that sketch in there is going to make my life a lot easier. So I don't spend too much time trying to figure out the hands. They're already figured out. I just have to clean the lines and really commit to those shapes. here I'm really thinking about that negative space that's created between the index finger and the middle finger here. That's what's going to give that the pose of that hand. And then same thing here, the way that that pinky almost comes in, curves up towards the other fingers. And I've exaggerated it just a little bit because I feel like that's the natural pose of the hand, and I really want to emphasize the pose of the hand. So in the same way that you would try to emphasize the pose of the whole body, you can do that with the individual parts as well.
Let's say you're not good with hands. What would be the alternative?
Okay, so if you're not good with hands, it's going to be challenging when you get to this point in the drawing, because you can't keep your hands very loose and rough and have the rest of your drawing be very tight and refined. So that's where practicing hands as much as you can is going to be really helpful. If you find that you're really good with everything else, but just the hands and feet, for example, are sort of a rough spot for you, focus on just drawing hands. So starting with very loose general shapes. So the same way that we did with the body. Okay, I usually think of the hands as sort of mittens. Right, so that would be my overall shape. Right, very, very loose, very simple. And then from there, I'm going to start refining some of those fingers. And then once I have that, then I can go in and I'm going to practice getting from this stage to the clean line work. If you're struggling getting your hands to this point, practice up to this point. Make sure that your gesture is perfect. Make sure that it's on point and it's very, very clear in what it's trying to communicate. And once you have that, then you can start practicing on cleaning up that line work to suit the gesture that you've created. Okay, but don't try to jump right into the details of drawing the hands if you don't get the actual gesture correct, because it's just going to make your life more difficult and it's just not going to look good. Hands, unfortunately, are one of those things that they're very challenging to draw, mostly because there's a lot of complex movement in them, and generally speaking, I like to study hands as their own separate thing. So just in the same way that I would do figure studies for the body, I would do hands as their own studies as well. So having a sketchbook just full of hand drawings, it's really, really going to help. So here again, I'm thinking about how that sleeve actually wraps around the wrist. Okay, so I'm not just drawing arbitrary lines and shapes. I'm really thinking about how does it actually work? What am I actually seeing happening? So I really want to get that sense of that cylinder wrapping around the wrist. And I love the fact that here the wrists are relatively thin, and then you have this very nice loose, baggy sleeve happening. That contrast is actually quite nice. Here again, rounding out the shoulders a little bit. I'm looking at the relationship between this fold right here and this outer fold going that way. And I'm seeing how this part right here is actually the outside line of this general fold shape right here. Right? So they're not two separate lines, they're a shape in itself. Okay, so it's the fabric actually turning and wrapping around this way. Okay, so that's how I have to think about that fold as I'm drawing it. I'm not necessarily going to see all those lines going through, but I am going to keep that in mind so that those lines and the relationship that they have together are going to be accurate, and it's going to feel like fabric wrapping around a form. So here's, this is one spot that I'm going to try and pay a little bit of attention to. One thing that you want to try and avoid in your drawings are what are called tension points. So tension points would be, for example, if I accidentally were to draw the edge of her clothing, of her sweater, lining up perfectly with the bottom of her hand. Okay, so something like that, it reads very, very awkwardly, and it's going to actually draw the viewer's attention to that point when you might not actually want that to be the case. So always try and break up your shapes so that they're not converging in the same point, and your shapes can be kept nice and separate. We can do a separate video on how to actually do folds and clothing because there's almost a science to that in itself. But for now, I'm just trying to get the basic lines going in here. And again, if I wanted to, I can go into a separate layer afterwards and clean up all of these lines as I go through. And you can see I've really broken up these lines here in the skirt. I've really thought about where are they starting, where are they ending, so that when I'm actually putting these lines in, it's going to look correct. So the more work that you put in at the beginning, the more patience that you have to get that rough sketch correct, the better your drawing is going to look, and the easier your life's going to be. Okay, so let's say we have something like that. And then I'll slowly move down. So unlike in the gesture stage where you're trying to draw the whole drawing at once, at this stage you can actually start from the top and just work your way down. Something to remember here is you want to try and keep your lines as clean as possible. Avoid anything that's like super scratchy like this, because it's just going to make your drawing seem very fuzzy. And it's just, it's not going to look good, and you're going to have to go over it again. So here, I'm cleaning up my lines. I'm trying to make sure that they're as close together as possible, making it look like one solid line. Get down here into the feet, and then same thing, I have my really loose sketch for the boots, and now I'm going to think about how that boot actually wraps around the foot, wraps around the ankle, points downwards. This is where I can start to indicate things like that little bit of a sole underneath, that heel as it pokes in from the back. So something like that. All right, so I might stop there for my line work, or if I feel like it's still a little bit messy in some places, I can go in and try to clean it up with an eraser, or I can actually make a new layer, lower the opacity on this one, create a new layer, and then go over it again and clean it up even more. In this case, I don't think that's going to be absolutely necessary. I think I can work with this when it comes to coloring. So from this point, I would move on to the next stage and I'll show you really quickly here. So if you actually spend a lot of time and patience cleaning up your line work, then it should read very, very easily. Okay? The cleaner it is at this stage, the easier it's going to be to actually add color in, and you're not going to sit there and be confused by what's happening with the actual lines. And even here, I'm noticing already that I actually I made the color a little bit too low. Like that. So I'm going to try and wrap that around a little bit better. Somewhere in there. Now notice how I did indicate a little bit of detail in these little lines coming down through the collar, but I kept them very, very, very light. Okay, so having that hierarchy of lines where these ones are darker, and we can see that those are the surface lines, they're more important, and then these lines here are very, very light, and so our brain reads them as not as important, they're secondary lines. And then once you go in and actually start coloring, those lines will be there as a guide, but they will disappear into the drawing, whereas these lines will stand out on the surface. Okay? So what happens now when we have a really clean line work and we want to actually start coloring it? So the rendering stage is actually going to be the longest stage in this process. So I did want to give myself enough time to actually work through some of those details with you guys and see if we can finish a drawing. So I'm going to have here, where is it? Baseball. Here we go. So let's say I have my sketch. Oh. I'm just going to get rid of those. So my reference is here. And then here is my drawing. Okay, so I've cleaned up the line work. And then now I want to actually go in and start coloring it. Now there's multiple ways that you can do this. There's the traditional painterly way of doing it, which is based on the way that you would normally paint if you were using oils or traditional media. And that's working everything in a single layer. Some artists love to work that way, totally fine, and it is a good thing to practice. However, the most common way to do this is to break it up into layers that all sort of work together, and it'll allow you to make changes much more easily as you're going through your drawing. So, first thing that I do is, once I have my line work, I'll create a new layer underneath, okay? And I'll call that one flat. And what I'll do is I'll find a color. It doesn't really matter at this point. It could be gray, it could be absolutely anything. And what you're going to want to do is, as accurately as you can, you're going to want to fill in your drawing. I'm not worried about individual areas of the drawing. I just want to get the silhouette nice and complete. Okay, so I'm going to go in and I'm going to try to get this as accurately as possible. If I go over the lines in any spots, I'm going to go in and clean it up with an eraser afterwards. Some people, they like to go in close and really color in the way you do with a colored pencil on paper and really make sure that it's really clean. Sometimes what I'll do, depending on my mood, is I'll be very, very loose with it, and then I'll go in afterwards with an eraser and just clean up those edges. And I'll zoom in and I'll just tidy up that coloring up to that line work. Oh. And you'll see, because I have strong line work already finished, this part of the drawing is going to be much, much easier. And so I can go in and clean all that up. And I'll sit here and I'll do this, and one thing that you're going to want to make sure you do is, you see how here some of these areas are actually lighter than the rest? That's because of the opacity of the pencil. Okay, so when you're drawing with a tablet, the lighter I press, the lighter that mark is going to be. For this stage, for the flat stage, you want it to be at maximum opacity. So sometimes what you can do is you can turn off the pressure sensitivity on your pen so that those lines come out much more clean. There's no variation in opacity. And you're not going to get those little light patches, because I'll show you in the next stage what happens if you have some areas that are more transparent than others. The coloring that you put over top is also going to come out transparent. So if I were to spend time working on those flat colors, I should end up with something that looks like this. Okay, it's a flat base tone. So here, some areas that I missed a little bit, perfectly fine. Go in, just clean them up. There we go. So I should have this really nice flat tone throughout the entire drawing. Even if I've missed some areas and they're not entirely perfect, it's okay because I'm going to make a lot of adjustments later on in my detail layers. But for now, I want to try to get this as close as possible. Again, the more time you spend on this, this part of the drawing, the easier it's going to be later on. So once I have this flat base color, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new layer on top, okay? And that layer, I'm going to lock it to that base layer. And in Photoshop, you hold Alt, and this little square is going to appear there, and you'll see that it'll create a little arrow pointing to that base layer. And what that does is it makes it so that this layer is now connected to that base, and now any color that I put over top is not going to color outside of that base layer. Okay? So now it makes my job a lot easier because I no longer have to worry about coloring inside the lines. Anything that I do is going to stay within that shape. Okay? So I'm going to do a new layer like this for each different part of my drawing. So let's say I want to start with the pants. Okay? So I'm going to look and I'm going to try to get the basic general lighting first, and then I'm going to worry about details afterwards. So right now what I'm seeing is a highlight around the back edge, and that I'm going to take care of later on in the effects and the lighting layers. So for now, I'm just going to focus on this larger area on the inside. For the most part, it is in shadow because the light's coming from behind her, but we can see some variation where it's transitioning towards this lighter blue, and then you have these darker shadow areas in the center. So I'm going to take my base color, and I'm going to go dark. I'm going to try to create a general color for these pants, which is going to be a sort of higher chroma, darker blue. And I'm just going to color in the pants. So the same way that I colored in that flat base layer, I'm going to do the same thing with the pants, being careful around the edges here where it comes to the skin because I want to be accurate. But anything lower than that, because my base layer is accurate, I can just fill it in, makes my life really easy. Okay? And then only when I get to these bottom edges do I actually have to spend a little bit more time to make sure that it's clean. So I might go down to somewhere here, like that. From this point, and you can see here, see if I can indicate it, you can see there, because in my flat layer, in my base layer, I didn't actually fill in that spot well enough, it still came out as white. So I can fill that in a little bit, like that. In some of these areas, I'm cleaning up as I go along. And this is where understanding your layers and really being organized with your layers is going to be very helpful, because the last thing you want is to get lost in a jumble of 100 different layers and you're trying to spend time finding where everything is. So now I have this, this flat sort of dark blue pant layer. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to lock it. So it's this little checkered box right here. And what that does is, in the same way that this layer of the pants, so here, pants, in the same way that that layer can't paint outside of the flat base, because I've locked it, I now also can't paint outside of that pant layer that I just drew. So anything that I color now is going to stay within those lines, and I'm not going to have to worry about cleaning it up later on. So a lot of this stuff is really just about making your life easier as you're going on. So what am I going to do? I'm going to take this color and I'm going to decide, okay, is this more of a shadow, or is this more of a highlight color, or is this more in the middle? I would say this is fairly mid-tone for me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start looking at my shadows and my highlights. The lighter areas are this nice mid bright blue. So I'm going to go in there, and here's where you can use a soft brush. So I'm going to click this a soft round brush with a pressure opacity on it, so that I can get this really nice fade in from the back coming down this way. I'm going to look for all the areas where the pants might start to get lighter as it wraps around that form. Okay, going to keep it very soft and very, very general. Here on the front of the leg, as that light starts to bounce over top, I'm noticing it a little bit lighter at the bottom, and the darkest areas seem to be right here in the crotch area. So I'm going to keep that relatively dark. Okay. And then I can go back in, pick that mid-tone color, and adjust some of that highlight back down, smooth it out until it looks more or less correct. I'm going to pick that mid-tone color again, and I'm going to say, okay, I want to go into those dark areas. So I'm going to take it darker, so we know much, much darker, and I'm going to notice, is the color getting more intense or is it getting more grayed out? And for me, I feel like I'm losing a little bit of intensity in there because the highlight is much more intense in color. I'm going to gray it down a little bit, so I'm going to pull it more to the left on my color swatch, and that's going to give me a nice desaturated color in there. Now here, if I take the airbrush and I just start going in, you'll see that that color bleeds into the leg up here, and I don't really want that to be the case. So one thing that I can do is I can either make my brush really small and color around it. Okay. I can make a new layer and then erase through it, or one thing that you'll see a lot of artists do, and especially it's easy if you have a tablet where you can draw directly on the screen, is you can take the Lasso Tool and you can select this inner part right here, go in with your brush, and then now I don't worry about going over onto that upper part of the leg. So it's going to give me a nice clean line. So I'm going to do something like that. And then now if I deselect it, you'll see there's a nice clean edge where this part of the leg wasn't selected. And I'll go in with that color into some of these spots up here where I'm going to get shadow from the folds. Again, being very, very loose, very general with this, because all those details, I'm going to go in and clean those up afterwards. So I'm going to add a little bit of a darker spot through there, up here. I'm adding more or less intensity as I go through, making adjustments. Right here again, we're thinking very, very general so that we can make those adjustments as we go on and we're not worried about ruining hours and hours of work. Okay, so now that I have a really general sense of lighting on my pants, okay, and I can usually zoom out to get a good sense of that, I'll zoom back in, and now I'll start going in and cleaning up some of these folds and some of these areas where I'll want to start getting in those smaller lighting effects, those highlights in the folds here. And actually this is a little bit less chromatic. So we'll go in there. I'm noticing this little bit of highlight around here. Through the front as it wraps up and around. Alright, and I'm going to get some indications of these little folds in the pants over here using a very, very small brush. I can start to add some of those little details in there. And same thing going in with that darker color to really reinforce the shadows on those folds. Same thing up here, adding more shadows. And I'm going to keep going like this until I have my pants fully rendered with my highlights and my shadows. I'm not worried about this really intense light around the edge just yet. That's something that I'm going to do later on. Okay, so for now, I just want to get the basic pants down. I also see these little highlights of detail in the stitching, so I can still do that on the same layer, or I can leave that for afterwards and do it on a separate layer as more like a detail. So in this case, if I were to do that, I would go in, so let's say I'm going to do it all in the same layer. I'm going to go in and just add a little bit of that highlight around here, that stitching. So you see I started very, very general, and now I'm working my way into the details as I go on. Making adjustments as I go, making any corrections as early as possible so that I don't have to worry about it later. So I'll keep going, and as I'm drawing, I'm trying to zoom out as much as I can as well to see if my drawing overall is looking correct. Then when I'm done with the pants, I might create a new layer. Same thing, I'm going to lock it to the flat base, but in this case I want it to be underneath the pants because I'm going to do the skin. So for the skin, I'm going to pick this really light, almost orangey color, and because that layer is underneath the pant layer, anything that I paint is still going to be underneath those pants. So try to keep the order of your layers in mind as you're doing this. So I might do my skin now as a separate layer. Here we go. So I'll label this skin. And then same thing, once I have my skin knocked in like that, then I'll lock the layer and start painting. Here I didn't clean up the lines of the skin simply because I know that everything else is going to go over top of that. So once I color in the hat and the hair and the shirt, it's going to cover up all those lines in the skin anyway, so I don't have to be necessarily too accurate with the skin layer right now. It's just a little trick to save you time. So once I have that locked, then I'm going to go in and say, okay, here in the front of her stomach, it gets a little bit more intense with that orange. It's a little bit warmer. So again, with that airbrush, I'm just going to try and get some of that color in there. As we get this almost cool bluish tone coming down along that side. So something like that. Again, keeping it simple, right, maybe warming it up just a little bit along this edge. Going back in. Fine adjustments can be made later on. Again, right now I just want to get the overall, the general feel correct. So under here it's going to be a little bit darker. Okay. So I'm going to look for areas of warmth, areas where it's going to be lighter. I'm going to look for changes in color temperature, so where the colors actually become more yellow or more red in certain places. So I'm noticing here on the bottom of the face it gets lighter, but it also gets a little bit more yellow. Whereas in the shadows it kind of starts to get a little bit warmer. It gets more into those orange tones. So I'm going to warm it up a little bit and get those colors in there. I'm going to keep going like this until I have all of my skin done. And I'm going to do this exact same process for the entire drawing, for all the different parts, until I'm happy with this level of detail that I have here in the pants. Okay? So it's not super, super highly rendered, but it's enough that 90% of your drawing is going to be complete. So I'll show you what that should look like. Let's just see here. I believe layer 7 is nothing. So hopefully it's nothing. I'm just going to lock these layers back on. So you should get to this point. Okay? For the most part, all the colors are in the right place. You can see here that I haven't quite finished the shoes and the glove, but you can see that I'm working in stages. And even though it is still a little bit fuzzy because I just went in with a soft brush, 90% of the drawing is fully painted and it's there. If I spend a little bit more time, I can actually sit and render out all those little highlights and all those details to get to this stage. Okay. Now, when I'm here, this is, I'm going to say, most people could stop here. But if you want to take it to that next level, this is where I would create a separate layer on top of everything that's going to be your detail layer. Okay, so your detail layer is not going to be locked to your flat base layer because we're going to want to be drawing outside of that layer. So for example, things like little strands of hair that come off of the silhouette. Okay? For example, down here. This is where I can go in and start to correct some of those lines that I'm seeing. Here in the sketch layer, right, I'm noticing some errors, so I can always go in and clean those up. I can go in and really start to refine the details, refine the edges of my drawing until they're all correct to the level of detail that I want. So I can keep going like this, adding a few loose strands more in the face. Again, it just gives that little bit of extra realism or that sense of life. And the reason I'm doing these in separate layers is so that if I need to make any changes or I don't like the details that I'm putting on, I'm not risking making massive drastic changes to layers that for the most part I've spent a lot of time working on and completing. So here, if I wanted to do this logo on her hat, I'm going to try to get that overall shape down. So something like that. And I'm going to say, okay, it seems a little bit off-center. Thankfully, it's on a separate layer, so I can just select that one part, and I can slide it over a little bit and adjust it so that it sits exactly where I want it to sit. So something more like that. Again, making adjustments as I go on. I'm noticing this really subtle pink outline around the D, and instead of just picking a brand new pink, I'm going to select colors that already exist in my drawing. That way there's a little bit more harmony. If your drawing is full of like 100 different variations of each color, it's just gonna appear like a big mess of colors. Whereas if you actually color pick specific colors to repeat over and over again in your drawing, it'll feel like it all goes together, like it's affected by the same lighting, it's all part of the same piece, as opposed to a bunch of separate drawings that are sort of just stuck together. So here, that D kind of gets lost a little bit in the lighting, so something like that. Okay. I might go in and add a little bit of shadow under there. And again, because it's on a separate layer, I don't have to worry about ruining what's underneath. So this is a great place to make any of those adjustments. Right back here, if I want to cool this down, I'm again selecting colors that already exist. So even in the skin, although the skin is a totally different color layer, I'm still going to pick purples and blues from the clothing to use as the cooler colors in the skin. So in there, and I'm doing it very, very lightly so that it still blends in with the skin. So you'll see this purple that I put in is still warm. It's still in this red zone. But because I'm using these purples and blues from the shirt, it's going to feel like it goes together much better. Again, color picking from around my drawing to clean up those details, adding a little bit of those highlights on the underside. And I'm going to keep going like this until I'm happy with the way that my drawing is turning out. So here, this lighter color, I want to warm it up a little bit. Maybe that's too much. I'm going to pull it back. And thankfully I can erase because, again, it's on a separate layer. So something like that. Okay. So once we got to this stage, I do want to start to add some special effects and give the lighting a little bit more interest. Okay, so the way I'm going to do that is using the color dodge tool. Now, color dodge is one of those things that's very easy to overdo. So you're going to want to be very, very subtle with it. And in order for color dodge to actually stand out, it's going to have to be on a dark background. So in this case, sometimes you can do just a dark gray, or you can pick a solid color. In this case, I drew a very, very simple gradient in the back, keeping the colors more or less consistent with what I had in the reference. So more of this creamy, sort of warmer tone on the bottom, this sandy color, and getting cooler as I move towards the top. Here I have this little white spot that popped out. So I'm going to try and find where exactly that came from. So it's this layer here, and I'm just going to go in and I'm going to erase that out. There we go. Okay, so this is my drawing. I think a lot of that is the overpainting that I drew before. So I should have something like this. The drawing itself is relatively finished. I thought a little bit about those edges and those highlights, but now is where we're really going to help those stand out. So I'm going to create a new layer here, and I'm going to set the layer type to color dodge. For color dodge, you're going to want to use a soft round brush so that you don't get any harsh edges. Okay. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to think of what color is my light going to be. So in this case, I'm going to want my light to be fairly light and probably more towards the bluish side. A nice cool light coming down from the sky. So I'm going to pick a nice blue. I'm going to go up here right along the top, and I'm going to make it closer to white in this case. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to really lightly brush those highlight areas. And you'll see that it gives this really nice glowing effect over your drawing. Now, this is really strong. Okay, so just leaving it like this is going to look really awkward. So I don't recommend overdoing it with this, but I'll show you how to correct for that afterwards. So here, adding a little bit of that maybe reflection of that highlight from the top of the cap. Maybe a little bit sort of back here, but it's reflecting on the back of her shirt. And then what you can do is you can lower the opacity on that color dodge layer to tone it down until it feels like a glow, but not a solid, bright sort of mark over top. Okay? So just a very, very subtle glow is still going to give the right effect, but it's not going to seem overpowering. So this for me is probably a good amount of color dodge. And so now from here, I'm going to go in and add a little bit more where I see fit. So over here, right on the edge of the pants, again, very, very subtle. Here I might add a little bit more blue because I see that in the pants that reflected highlight is much more chromatic. So I'm going to add a little bit more blue to it as it's coming through. And then I might go with the white, again, sort of around those edges, just to give that glow. So something like that. Here in the shoes as well, and some of those spots. Right there. So overall, it's going to give a really nice intensity to your drawing. And you'll see if I bump up that color dodge, it really enhances that glow. So it's up to you to decide how much of a glow you want. Depending on what you're drawing, you might actually want more or less of that in your drawing. So for example, if you're going to do lightning or something with like a very dramatic, bright light source, having your color dodge at 100% is actually going to help you achieve that effect. Whereas here, the clothing itself is not actually glowing. It's just reflecting a little bit of light from the environment. So I'm going to try to keep it as subtle as I can. And then maybe in some areas, like right here where that D is, because I'm seeing how that highlight almost makes the edge of that D disappear, it makes it seem like the light's really intense there. So I might just add a little bit of extra color dodge right in that spot, just to help really reinforce and sell that idea that that spot is super bright. Okay. Adding a little bit of that color through the hair a little bit, just to enhance the color. So something like that. Right, it's very, very subtle. A little bit inside the pants to give a little bit more chroma. Now, for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, when I talk about things like chroma, when it comes to color, there are three sort of levels that you're playing with. So the first is your value. So value is going to be how light or how dark something is going to be. So let's see if I can just do it on a separate layer here. You have your white, sort of like a gray, right? So if you think of, let's just do this with like a harder edge brush. Here we go. So I have something like that, something like that. So if you think of your basic value scale, okay? So something that looks like this. So those are your values. Just light and dark. Oh. Let's just clean that up like that. Okay, so there's value. Chroma is how intense or how gray that color is, and that's usually the left and right on your color swatch. So for example, I can have a really toned down grayish blue over here. And as I move further to the left, you'll see that the color gets more and more intense as it goes on. Okay. Obviously, the higher that I go, the lighter it's also going to get until you have this almost bright neon color in the top left-hand corner. Okay. So that's your chroma. And then the last one is going to be your color temperature, and that's this bar right over here. So that's where you're going to adjust how warm or how cool your color is, how, if you want to add more gray, or sorry, not more gray, more blue or more green or more red, you're going to do it from this side. So I can have the exact same value, okay, and the exact same chroma, right, so I can keep it somewhere here in the middle, but if I start off with this blue, I can make it more purple, more red, and eventually if I keep doing this, I'm going to end up with a full sort of rainbow color pattern as I go on. Okay. Let's move that back here. So see here, the values themselves are not changing, the chroma is not changing, it's the actual color temperature itself that's changing. Okay, so those are the three sort of valves that I'm working with when I'm picking my colors. So generally speaking, if you are if you're looking at your drawing and you're trying to make adjustments to, for example, your shadows, don't just make them darker, but also look at things like how intense is that color getting and what's the color temperature looking like. So for example, in the skin, you'll see that over here, this is sort of my base color. As I go into the shadows, I get darker, but it also loses chroma. It's becoming a little bit more gray. Okay, it's becoming a little bit more gray, and you can see here that it's actually getting a little bit cooler as well. It's moving away from that yellow towards the purples. Not too much, but just enough that it's going to make that little bit of a change, and it's going to make your drawing feel less monochromatic, like it's all just one single color. Okay. Here you can see again how I'm very warm in this area, but as I move down through the face, it moves much more towards those yellows. Right? So it's a subtle change, but it's going to make a big difference in your drawing. Okay? So moving from cool to warm, from intense, bright, vibrant color to less chromatic grays, and then obviously from light to dark as well. So I'm always thinking of those three things as I'm adjusting color, and this is one of those things that it's going to take a lot of time and practice to really get used to how to play with those three valves and those three levels to get your colors to be correct. But always, 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 if you're going to be changing your color to add shadows or to add highlights or whatever it might be, always try and make sure that you're adjusting all three of those things as opposed to just one. And that's how you're going to get a much more natural look to your coloring. Okay. All right. So if I really wanted to here, I can go into my color dodge again. I'm going to do this on a separate layer just because I don't want to make it super ugly in case it doesn't work. But I can also pick colors, for example, this bright pink, and using my soft airbrush, I can really add some intensity to that glove. Right, so I can just give it that pop of nice vibrant color, just like that. Same thing with those blues. Right, I might get a nice blue in there and just really knock in some of those really intense areas in those pants. Again, careful not to overdo it, but it might just help you get a little bit extra life and effect into your drawing. So I'll go underneath, being very, very gentle with my brush strokes because I want them to be subtle. I don't want a hard edge along my my glow, or else it's going to feel like a neon lamp, right? Which is probably not what you want. I'm going to go again with this almost yellow color and just kind of get those warm highlights in there. And then in here, I might go with cooler color on this side. And so really to enhance the coolness of the shadows on that side. Maybe even go into that purple a little bit. Right, very, very large brush. That way I lose that edge as much as I can. And you'll see that here it's starting to look almost like a rave, right? There's so many colors and glowing effects that are happening. I am going to adjust those by lowering the opacity on that color dodge layer once I've put it in all the right places. Same thing with the skin. So here, if I find that the skin is too gray or it's not quite intense, there's not quite enough life in it, I can go in with a really nice high intensity, bright sort of warm orange color. And I'm going to try and pop in some of those highlights. Now you'll see here that it's picking up the yellows in the skin quite a bit. So what I'll probably want to do is I'll want to warm that up even more so that the color dodge picks up more of those reds. And it seems like it's struggling to pick those up, so I'm going to go even lower. So there we go. So now it's starting to pick up more of those pinks, those red colors. But you'll see that it also makes your drawing lighter. So if I really go in, it's going to brighten everything way too much. Right, so I'm going to go here, really high intensity. I want to pick up those really nice oranges in the skin, brighten some of those areas. Let's go with like a pure red here. There we go. There we go. So I had to go really intense into the reds to pick up that nice warm color in the skin. All right, here you'll see if I bring that red over the pants, it's going to look really weird. So I'm going to try and be very subtle with where I add that color dodge so that it's only in the spots that I really want it. Here, because the shoes themselves are kind of this grayish color, it's very like muted purple, I'm not going to add something super bright to it because it's just going to make the shoes seem super colorful when that's not the case. So I might minimize the color dodge effect in those grayer areas, or if I really want to enhance them, I might keep the chroma on there very, very low so that it's not picking up as much color and it's just giving me a little bit of that enhanced glow effect. And so maybe under here. Again, one of those things where it's very, very easy to overdo. So something like that, and then let's grab some of this warm orangey color over here and get some of that highlight in the hair as well. Right in there. Right on the side. Okay, so there we go. It's super intense right now. Right? This is almost obnoxiously bright. This might be the effect that you want. 100%, if that's the case, no problem. However, if you want to keep your drawing more tame, a little bit more realistic, I would lower the opacity on that color dodge layer until it's just a little bit of a subtle glow. Okay. So somewhere here, and I'll practice turning that on and off just so that I can see what it looks like. So let's see here what it looks like just without the white highlight underneath. I do like it with both, so I think having this toned down to maybe like a 20%, something like that, maybe a little bit lower. Okay, so now I've got my drawing with the lighting effects, and this is usually where I will stop. If I wanted to, of course, I could go in and spend even more time refining textures and going in there and getting all those tiny little variations in the actual textures in the clothing. Sometimes I might actually remove the line work altogether and paint over that. In this case, I'm not going to spend time doing that because it's going to take hours and hours of rendering, and the more time you spend, the more realistic it's going to be. But you don't always necessarily want to bring your drawing to that level. Right? So in here, I could technically see that there are little variations in the stitching. So I could go in there and start adjusting those little details all throughout and make it even more realistic, cleaning up some of these little line areas, making them super accurate. It all just depends at this point how much work you want to put into it. However, I think for the sake of this demonstration, that's more than enough detail just to show you guys how I would take a drawing from start to finish. So we can see that if I just lower this, we have from the beginning we have our guy, which I believe is this layer here. So I'm just going to move these over so that you can see them all together. So very, very rough sketch, slightly more refined sketch. Let me just extend this canvas a little bit more. There we go. So put this right there. Let's make it a little bit bigger. And then we have the girl with the line work in there. On the side, I did have another drawing that I started working on. Same thing, just brought it up to the line work. But that in itself is the process that I would go through to get from a rough sketch all the way to a finished rendered painting. Ooh, my voice. It definitely feels like I've been talking for an hour and a half nonstop. Okay. So, for the next live drawing session, I would like to possibly go into maybe some portraiture, or I have a whole bunch of different ideas, maybe clothing and fabric, maybe some stylized characters. If you guys have any suggestions, you can feel free to leave those in the comments. We'll definitely try and take your advice, and if there's anything specific that people want to see, we'll try to include those in the next videos. We will try to do videos more often. Right now, we're looking at about once every 2 weeks. We're going to try and eventually build up to maybe even once a week. So hopefully this was helpful for you. If you have any questions, please feel free to message us on our social media in the comments for this video, or send us an email, give us a call at Lux Academy, and we'll be glad to answer any questions that you might have. If there are no other questions in the chat, I'm going to end that there. like I said, I really hope this was helpful. Thank you so much for everyone who was watching this video live, or for anyone who is watching this after the fact. Like I said, I really hope this helped to simplify things a little bit for you. I know there's a lot to take in and there's a lot of practice that goes into it, but if you follow things step by step and you don't try to jump ahead too much, you can get some really, really great results. Okay, so again, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you guys in the next video.